Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this session entitled Reflection from Operations. I'm conscious that we've got a sort of post-lunch slot, so we'll do our best to try not to send you to sleep during the course of the next hour or so. And just to try and make sure that is the case, we'll try and keep our sort of opening remarks, as it were, to about 40 minutes or so, and leave the rest of the time for questions. I think we're billed as saying that we're going to deliver personal perspectives on our experiences of working alongside the military to highlight how civil servants can make a real difference in service delivery in politically sensitive and high-risk theatre of operations. Before we sort of get into that, you might ask, who are we and why are we qualified to talk about that? And so I'll sort of introduce my colleagues as we go through and give you a little bit of cheesy photos to go with where we were and what we were doing. Just to my right, we've got Lindy Cameron, who was the head of the Provincial Reconstruction Team in Helmand Province between October 2009 to October 2010, and was previously the head of DFID in Kabul, and before that in Baghdad. Mark Scully was a policy advisor to the British headquarters when it was based in Kandahar in Afghanistan in 2009-10, and is currently one of the managers of a scheme which is run by the MOD called Support to Operations, which looks at how we support the civilians who are in deployed roles overseas. And then finally, I was the policy advisor to the senior British general in Baghdad in 2006-07, who was the deputy commander of the multinational forces out there. And I'm currently at the Permanent Joint Headquarters, which is responsible for all UK overseas operations. And as part of that role, I have responsibility for the safety and security of all UK-based MOD civilians overseas on that basis. So that's who we are. I'm the man in the slightly dodgy sort of man from Del Monte suit, and you can probably work out the other two as we go through. I don't intend to spend too much time concentrating on my own particular experiences as part of this talk. We'll use Afghanistan as a sort of vehicle for discussion, which will sort of reflect the experiences of the two people on my right. What I will do is, in the first instance, set out some of the operational context and set out where we have people now in terms of both military and also civilians on operations. And then Lindy will talk about her experience of overseeing and leading the Provincial Reconstruction Team, before Mark gives us some potted highlights of his time in Kandahar, and then talk about some of the opportunities that there are for civilians working alongside the military as we speak. And then quickly, we'll do some summing up before we move on, opportunity for some questions where we'll hopefully get into a bit of an interactive discussion. Just to sort of put in context where we are and where we've got operations. There are currently about 16,000 people in terms of military deployed in operations. And you might go, well, where are those if only 9,500 people are currently deployed in Afghanistan? And you'll see that I've put up there effectively three different sets of things. A small number of UN operations, which I can talk about very briefly in a moment. Then we have people at what we call our permanent joint operating bases in Cyprus, Gibraltar, the Falklands, Ascension Islands, and also Diego Garcia. And then we have sort of small numbers of people who are deployed on various different operations under UN banners as we go through around the world. And you'll see there's actually quite a sort of splattering of people around there. You might wonder why we've got people supposedly on operations in Tampa, Florida. It sounds like a tough tour. We have people there who are based advising the Americans, which is where their central command is. And we have people, as I say, who provide UK policy advice into the Americans so that we have a better understanding of what they're doing and they have a better understanding of what we're doing. So just to touch on that, as I say, United Nations, people in Cyprus, Sudan, in Darfur, in the Congo, and other missions which we have where we normally are requested to send small numbers of advisors to help out on missions to advise different forces as they help out under that context. The permanent joint operating base is where the bulk actually of the other sort of 5,000 or 6,000 people other than Afghanistan are based. We have to have sort of a significant number of people in Cyprus, where we have what's known as a theatre reserve battalion, where we, if necessary, will deploy people from Cyprus into places like Afghanistan and previously also into Iraq, where we need to particularly reinforce for a particular area for a particular part of an operation. We still have a small number of people in Iraq who are helping doing officer training for the Iraqis. and a few people sort of dotted around the broader Middle East, including in Bahrain, which helps to coordinate the UK's counter-piracy mission, where, of course, we've been leading the EU mission to try and do things like protection of world food convoys off the coast of Samarra and the sort of Horn of Africa. We have people in Libya, and I might touch on that in a moment, and of course we have Afghanistan. What I would say is that when you take all that as a sort of big mix, there's quite a diversity of missions, cultures, and environment, and a range of different skills and requirements which you need to do that. And one of the advantages that civilians have as part of this is that they can actually help to bring that sort of understanding in those contexts, which you might not always get from some of our military counterparts. And in all those different operations, in some way, form or another, there is civilian involvement in them all. And in significant numbers of those, we have civilians deployed alongside military counterparts as we speak. So for example, on Afghanistan, just to give a bit of context before moving into some experiences, currently 47 participating NATO, countries working under a NATO International Stabilization Afghanistan Force plan. And as you will have heard yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that we would be ending our combat role in 2014 and that our current UK force level of 9,500 would be coming down to 9,000 by the end of 2012. We have a sort of set of minimum objectives which were there in terms of what is it that you might sort of categorize success as looking at. And effectively, you can probably summarize these into three things. One of which is significant progress towards a sustainable political settlement. The second is a viable Afghan state which is stabilized sufficiently to challenge international terrorism and extremism within Afghanistan's borders. And thirdly, Afghan national security forces who are sufficiently capable to manage any residual insurgents. And just to put in the context of the significant numbers of civilians involved, there are three sort of prime groupings that are shown down there. First of all, there are about 200 MOD civilians deployed in Afghanistan at any one time, and I'll touch on the roles which they do in a moment. We also have Provincial Reconstruction Team, which Lindy will talk about shortly. And then obviously there are the Foreign Office who are there in usual sort of diplomatic guise, but clearly the situation which you'd find them is a bit more challenging than you would do, for example, let's say Washington in comparison. Equally, we have sort of numbers of people in Libya. For example, there's a diplomatic mission in Benghazi, which is led by the Foreign Office. We've got a person there called Sir John Jenkins, who leads that and deals with the National Transitional Council. And we also sent out for a period of 3 or 4 weeks a stabilisation response team to make an assessment of the likely needs post-conflict that would be required for Libya. So those are examples of the sorts of things which we're talking about. Of the sort of 200 MOD civilians, of which I personally have more of an involvement with, we have about 18 different roles, and I've just highlighted some of the more common ones, one of which is policy advisor, which both myself and Mark have done. Civil secretary, you've got people who are sort of looking after finance, looking after priority issues, and then you work all your way through various different support things there. We've also got the MOD police who are providing a job in training the Afghan local police and the Afghan National Security Forces in sort of British policing methods. But it's easier for the MOD to put out some of its Ministry of Defence police than it can be on occasions for local home forces. But we do have local sort of forces, Home Department forces, also deploying on operations, and we certainly had quite a lot of that happening in Iraq. It's actually not new to have civilians in operations. They've sort of nearly always been there in support in one form or another. Certainly in the policy advisor role, you can look back to sort of World War II. Sir Percy Cox was the advisor in Mesopotamia and ended up, I think, practically running the country in the end. And certainly, it's sort of more recent times, going back to the first Gulf War, we had a policy advisor in Sir Peter de Bellier's force headquarters when we went into Iraq in the first instance. So it's not new, it's something which has been happening for quite some time, but I don't think people necessarily have the same sort of visibility of it. Just before sort of handing on to Lindy, I think in terms of just setting out why it is that it's essential to have civilians, this is something which Alistair Burt actually said last month. in terms of the role of civilians in working alongside military colleagues and the local community to prevent and reduce conflict is critical. In Afghanistan in particular, the achievements of civilian personnel are an essential part of the transition process. I think with that, it's probably best to hand on to Lindy, who will talk particularly about that subject.
Thanks, Paul. Great. So, I was the head of the provincial reconstruction team in Helmand in Afghanistan for a year between 2009 and 2010. So what you might ask yourselves is a provincial reconstruction team. Well, it's slightly what it says in the tin. It's basically a team which works at province level, which is a kind of county level structure of government in Afghanistan. And it's partnered with the local government in that province, both the administration and the political side, in order to help them stabilize the province. The other key partner for a provincial reconstruction team is, of course, the military units that you're working alongside, both international and indeed Afghan. Specifically, it's a civil military team, so it's a team that's got both civilians and military in it, from all sorts of different backgrounds, and I'll come to that in a second. But in Helmand specifically, it was also a multinational team, as you can see with the flags on the slide. It was UK-led, that was me, and indeed majority UK staffed, but we also had very significant numbers of US staff, and also Danes and Estonians. The Danes led on education and the Estonians on health. And indeed, we also had people who were masquerading as others. In fact, one of our theoretical Danes was actually an Australian who'd been contracted by them. So it was an incredibly multinational team, and indeed actually also very diverse in all sorts of different ways. This is the team as it was in about April last year, basically. All ages, all backgrounds. I had policemen, I had lawyers, I had prison officials, I had political scientists, agricultural experts, people from the development background, people who were experts in small businesses, literally all ages. They're none quite as young as the chap at the front. And indeed actually from all sorts of backgrounds. For some it was the first time they'd been out on operations, and some were like Lashkar-Gah. For some they'd done it many times before. And for me it was my third major deployment to this kind of environment. And nice as it looks there with the carpets in the front, Lashkar-Gah is pretty much a small town a very long way away from the capital of Afghanistan. Actually quite a nice place to live in terms of places in Helmand you can live, but in the middle of what's obviously a very difficult and challenging province for us to work in. So, a pretty big leadership challenge for me personally, not least because I have to say some of the military would look at me and think, you know, she's still quite young for this job, and indeed female. So quite a lot of personal challenges for me as a leader, and indeed a huge challenge to try and pull this civil military team from all these different backgrounds together in what's an extremely high profile operation in a pretty challenging environment. And what was the context we were working in then? So basically, if you remember, and many of you will probably have seen the recent BBC programmes on the 10-year anniversary of our engagement in Afghanistan. In 2006, British troops went into Helmand, which had been a fairly sleepy province, but is part of the heartland for the Taliban in Afghanistan. I think it's probably fair to say that in 2006, we underestimated the scale of the challenge that we would face, and the insurgents certainly responded rather more aggressively than the plan had anticipated. Resources since then have grown very significantly on both the military and the civilian side from what we thought we needed back in 2006. And I'd personally been the head of DFID up in Kabul during that period in 2006 to 7, so I'd seen the challenges that we faced at the beginning of that deployment and understood quite how difficult it was. I'd also seen then, I think, a real upturn in 2008 when Governor Mangal arrived in the province, and that's the guy on the left. He's the provincial governor of Helmand. Until then, we'd been faced with a series of Afghan leaders in Helmand who, one of whom was a technocrat who didn't really have the political skills, one of whom was then actually a very local leader, but less interested in some of the administrative side. Governor Mangal had been a governor of 2 provinces previously in other parts of Afghanistan, so loads of experience, also a very charismatic figure, and really understood that his job as governor was both to get out and persuade people in Helmand that actually they wanted to be part of the government of Afghanistan, but also actually to get the provincial government running effectively so that they could really deliver that. But still some challenges. I think 2009, if you cast your minds back, there was a really quite difficult summer. This was the summer where President Obama was considering whether to send additional troops to Afghanistan and indeed what the US strategy should be. I arrived shortly after General McChrystal advised that he wanted and needed extra troops for the operation. And it was a time when Operation Panchai Palang was happening. So the chap on the right-hand side is one of my stabilization advisors who's demonstrating that a Javelin missile case is an excellent, if slightly expensive, seat when you're stuck in a tent in the middle of a very challenging district in 45-degree heat, sleeping in what you can see in the background, which is a sort of mosquito net style tent inside the tent. Not a very easy life, but a hugely rewarding one. But a very tough summer, where basically casualties were quite high for all sorts of reasons, and where I think confidence began to shake about whether the mission in Helmand was achievable. So quite a tough environment, but one where we knew that the underlying changes were already beginning to take, better leadership by Governor Mangle, but also the resources we needed to actually get on track. So, how did I see the challenges as I arrived in Helmand then? I think that in retrospect, and I'm not sure I was as clear about them at the time as I am now, they were threefold. Basically, the first challenge was actually to try and get the entire PRT focused on supporting the single government of Afghanistan plan, sequencing and prioritizing resources to make sure that we really focused on the areas we needed to help the government hold sustainably, rather than changing the idea of what the top priority was every 6 months with a new brigade arriving or indeed new civilians arriving. We needed consistency and continuity, and we also needed to focus on what has now become a much bigger element of the campaign, transition. We needed to recognize that success in Afghanistan was going to be defined by us being able to leave successfully, us being able to hand over a lot of the things we were supporting to an Afghan government that was capable of delivering them themselves, both in security and in terms of civilian resources. Actually, that plan was not that difficult to develop, but in fact, it took quite a lot of effort to hold people to it over the course of the year. And that challenge was a huge issue for me as each new commander came in with a perception of what they thought was important. Secondly, I needed a team that could deliver. By the stage I got there, I had a really large PRT, over 100 people based in Lashkar, and then teams in, I think, 7 or 8 of the different districts spread around Helmand, some very close to the front line. What I needed was a team that was structured properly so that they could deliver. So being an ex-McKinsey consultant, I have to confess, I did a quick sort of 7S analysis on the team to work out where the challenges were. And some of them were huge but untacklable. So the IT, for example, I had 5 different computers on my desk and 4 different phones. No way I was going to fix that in a year. Some of them were going quite well. The team pretty much actually were the right staff with the right skills, because the stabilization unit had been training people with the right kind of skill set to go out there. And indeed, the MSSG, which is the Military Support to Stabilization Group, had been getting our military colleagues skilled up as well. But actually what I could do was focus on the shared values that the team had. And indeed, in my style of leadership, I could focus on trying to get them all to understand they were part of a single team working together. What I've seen go badly in this kind of operation before is when everybody thinks that they are individually responsible for making sure that they or their boss don't have to take the rap when things go wrong. That's almost inevitably destined to fail. But it's very difficult to get a whole team, people from a whole range of different organizations, different ministries within the UK, as well as different backgrounds entirely, to feel that what they need to do is all work together to take collective responsibility for success in such a challenging environment. So the third challenge then was actually trying to manage my stakeholders. And I have to say, from my perspective, this probably took up the majority of my time. And when I say stakeholders, I mean everybody from politicians and senior civil servants back in the UK, across all the different departments, to the endless stream of military visitors I had turning up to find out what I was doing, to the Afghan stakeholders. Governor Mangle, although doing a very good job in Helmand, actually was unfortunately not seen to be doing such a good job by President Karzai, who was being constantly advised by one of the former governors of Helmand that things have been much better in his time. So a real issue about managing both Afghan stakeholders and indeed the international stakeholders, not just the UK side, but also the Danes, the Estonians, and the Americans, particularly as the American presence in Helmand expanded during the year. And as I say, a huge issue for me and one that I spent most of my time on. So, how did it go in the course of the year? I think that it probably went better than you might pick up if you simply watched the media coverage. I'm pretty clear that we've managed to turn around the situation in Helmand to a situation where I think that tactical success in Helmand is feasible, but we'll still need an awful lot of work from now to 2014 to make sure that we can do what we aspire to, which is hand over the leadership for security and governance in that province to an Afghan government that's capable of doing it with much less support from us. I do think that life is a lot better. If you look at that picture, you'll see that there's a small kid who's being strangled about right in the middle, sort of just up from the bottom. His name is Lala. and he was the kid who used to meet me every time I went to Marja, which was one of the districts in Helmand. And he's now in school. The last time I saw him was when he was starting second grade, along with all of his mates who, having not been in school for a few years under the Taliban, were a total nightmare for the headmaster to try and keep under control, who was running around looking rather stressed. And life is a lot better for him and for his family than it was a couple of years ago when the Taliban were in control of his district. We've put in place a lot of mechanisms for understanding, for monitoring and evaluating what's going on in Helmand and how well we're doing. But actually, when you come back from a tour like I did, the things you hold on to personally are the memories of kids like that little boy whose life is better as a result of some of the things we've done there. And for me personally, I think it was a hugely challenging experience and one that I've learned an awful lot from. Civil service values like impartiality and indeed honesty are sometimes words on a poster when you're sitting in the UK, but actually when you are trying to give good advice to somebody who's making decisions about people's lives, both Afghan and Brits and other internationals, actually, those values really start to mean something. Because if you get it wrong, it has massive consequences. But also, actually, if you say the thing that's popular at the time, as opposed to give the honest advice that may be tough to hear, but needs to be said, again, you're not doing yourself or indeed anybody else a service. So I learned a lot about it. I think I'm probably better at my job as a result. I miss it hugely in many ways because it was a hugely formative experience for me and I think for everybody else who was out there. So with that, what I will do is hand over to somebody else who I overlap with in my tour there, who was based in Kandahar. All right.
Thanks, Lindy. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today and share with you my experiences of working alongside the military in Afghanistan. Just by way of background, I was sent to, but as a volunteer, to a large UK-led NATO headquarters based just outside the southern city of Kandahar in Afghanistan. I was sent there to provide policy advice to the UK members of that headquarters and also to provide advice on some of the NATO issues, it being a NATO headquarters. One of my major roles really was making sure that back in the UK, people had a very clear understanding, both within the MOD and the other government departments involved in the Afghan campaign, about what the plans were that this headquarters were making that would have a direct impact on the UK troops that were based in and around central Helmand and on the activities of Lindy's PRT at the time. I was supposed to add value. I was under riding orders to add value by ensuring that the military didn't just focus on conducting military operation and focusing on security tasks, but they were always seeking to be coherent with and complementary to things like the Helmand Plan, which Lindy's explained was really, really important if we're going to have continual progress in extending the government of Afghanistan's reach into central Helmand. And as Paul explained, I was there because we always send civilians with our deployed forces, and it was made very clear to me that people had done very well in the past, and I wasn't to ruin it in my tour. It'll be no surprise, I think, for you to hear that I did find it a very challenging experience. The first thing I would say is that the environment itself is very challenging. You work very long hours. The military operations are conducted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and across the south of Afghanistan, so several provinces. And they have to be linked in with other governance and stabilization activities if they're going to have a lasting effect. From day one, it was made very clear to me that I would earn my rations and I would deliver. So it would be unacceptable of me to go to planning meetings and be involved in discussions and just take notes and report back to the UK on what I was hearing. People expected me, as they do from their military colleagues, to, from day one, be able to add something to the discussion. And that is particularly challenging. Inevitably, as the only or one of the only civilians in a very large military environment, I didn't have the luxury of blending in a uniform. And you acted as a lightning rod for what were perceived to be poor policy or political decisions made in the UK or within other large international organisations. It was challenging, but it was a challenge I actually relished because it did give me the opportunity to explain to people how policy decisions were made and how in the future, if they didn't reflect the realities on the ground, how you could use my role to help influence policy making in the future. And perhaps the final real challenge was I was one person fulfilling that role within what was a very large headquarters. Well over 400 staff officers supporting or directing over 50,000 troops in the south of Afghanistan from a myriad of nations. And as you can imagine, that means there was quite a lot going on, and I really needed to ruthlessly prioritize my time and prioritize my efforts so that I was actually influencing the key tasks that were going on in the headquarters, adding to the planning that was being done, and making sure that the reporting and analysis I was providing back to the UK was absolutely on the money. And as an individual where I was expected to do all of that, to be everywhere all at once and support a commander, that was quite difficult. However, overall, I'm pleased to tell you that it was a very rewarding experience as well, in equal measure. I was able to add that value, and in particular to the planning that went on at the time for what was called Operation Mostarak, to extend Afghan governance into central Helmand, into the region of Marja in particular, and that involved a lot of UK troops, and we ensured that we worked very closely with Lindy's PRT, so that we did actually do what we were supposed to do. We didn't just provide a stable and secure environment. It was then followed by governance and stabilisation activities, and it was all done in coordination with our Afghan partners. And I was able to provide confidence back to the UK that the planned operations, so what the military was saying was going to happen, these plans were well-resourced plans, and they would actually work, where perhaps there had been failings in previous operations. Over time, I felt that my hard work was recognised. I found that the headquarters involved me in their decision-making processes and their discussions much earlier, when they realised I could actually add value to the work that they were doing. And the flip side of it really being a very pressured environment with a really high tempo of work, where the work involves a lot of complex issues and sometimes unpalatable issues, I did make a great deal of very firm friends. And those working relationships I established in Afghanistan are actually today paying off for me as I work in main building and at the permanent joint headquarters, because I'm bumping into the same military officers that I worked with in Afghanistan, and where our paths crossed, we've already got a good working relationship, and our work now in the UK benefits from that. And the final real takeaway from me in terms of the experience was that I have a very clear picture in my mind. So Afghanistan, I previously served also in Kosovo and Iraq, and all of that taken together gives me a very clear picture in my mind of how, as a country, we can achieve our foreign and defence policy aims in a country like Afghanistan. So I understand which actors are involved and how they interact, and I've seen examples of where it has worked and where it hasn't worked so well. And so again, as my career goes on, I'm still relatively junior in the civil service. I hope to be in a situation where I'll be able to be involved in a future intervention and bring all of those experiences to bear. So really, I had a fantastic opportunity through the Ministry of Defence, but I'd just like to take some time now to explain to you some of the opportunities that are available to you all here today. The first set are for those people that work in defence at the moment or may in the future work in defence. Paul earlier explained the variety of different roles that our civil servants deployed to Afghanistan or around the world in, and how they all deploy through the Support to Operations scheme that I currently manage. We do expect our civil servants to have the skills and experiences to perform well in those roles before they arrive or before they're sent out to a specific country. But the scheme itself gives specific training and support so that they will, we have every confidence, succeed in a difficult operational environment. And what we also do is we have a very comprehensive support mechanism for the families that get left behind. So that gives the reassurance to the person that deploys that they will have help if they need it. And if the worst happens and they need to bring you back from an operational theatre, that can happen very quickly. I suppose the icing on the cake as well is another process towards the back end. We don't just use people and throw them away. We do have processes in place to exploit the skills and experiences that our civil servants gain in Afghanistan, not just in different areas within the Ministry of Defence, but also if there's another government department working on the Afghan campaign, we can loan staff to those departments so that they too can benefit from the experiences that our people have had. We're not the only department that sends civil servants out to countries like Afghanistan, and so the other set of opportunities that you do have are through the Stabilisation Unit. They are the home of the Civilian Stabilisation Group. That group has over 1,000, is 1,000 strong, maintained around that level. It's full of people from both the public and the private sector, and whether they have their expertise lies in the civil or military worlds. And they're deployed to a wide range of countries that are fragile or recovering from violent conflict. So out of that 1,000, at the moment there are just over 200 civil servants in the group. They're drawn from over 30 government departments across a wide range of grades. And they've told me that at the moment they particularly need civil servants with strong stabilisation, defence, development and what's the other one? Diplomacy skills. And they do the same thing as the MOD. They make sure that you are trained and supported so that you will be able to deliver in role. And perhaps slightly different from the MOD, their tours or their assignments will be much shorter or longer, depending what the government of the day wants to get out of an involvement in whichever country those civilians are being sent to. My final point really is about recognition. I felt personally that my service in Afghanistan was recognised, and in some cases admired by my family and friends, by my work colleagues. I think over time it will benefit my career. But I think it's also important to note that a royal warrant was issued quite recently that's established the Civilian Service Medal Afghanistan. And this will ensure that every civilian that has worked in Afghanistan will receive recognition from the country in a tangible way for all of their efforts. And I think that's a really good thing. Thank you.
Just briefly, to sort of summarise where we got to. Effectively, I think you should be able to have told from what we've just set out that there are civilians involved in all UK overseas operations. I won't sort of labour on the sort of different benefits which are set out there. It's something which is sort of deeply personal. Different people get different things out of having been on operations and working with the military. Those are things which I've just listed there, which I think are probably relatively common that people get. But as I say, it really depends on who you are and what you personally will take away from that particular experience. Mark set out some of the opportunities that exist. This isn't a recruiting fair, so I won't labour on those either. But clearly, if anyone does want to sign up, then we can start taking names as you leave. I think if we do now, what I think we'll open up to questions. And we'll field them through, and please ask as sort of, we'll start off with some easy ones and then ask us the difficult ones as we go along.
I think it does. I think it depends a little bit where you're working. So the conflicts I've worked on are ones that have all been extremely high profile. So I've been lucky enough to have a really good sense from the sort of front line of how policy making is made all the way up to the top, including having frequent visits from ministers and the Prime Minister to the theatres I was working in. So actually it gives you a pretty good sense of how political direction to civil servants works on some of those pretty tricky issues and pretty time sensitive ones. And it gives you a really good insight into the way the media plays in that as well, I think, and the impact it has on public opinion at home, but also the impact it has actually back in the country you're working in. And I think that you realise quite how different it can look like from different ends of the telescope. So that certainly helps me give much better policy advice back in the UK to have understood what it's like out there. I think it also, certainly for me, my background is DFID as a department, but my last job was Foreign Office, and the one before that was Cabinet Office, which is where Paul and I work together. I think it certainly made me a much better, in a sense, cross-Whitehall civil servant as well. I'm much better at thinking about what HMG's perspective on this is collectively, rather than what my own department specifically's perspective is. And I think that you realise the costs of not doing that if you have seen the consequences in these very challenging environments. So I think it makes you a sort of more collaborative, more joined up civil servant as a result of that.
Yeah, I had a lot of challenges working, obviously, as a policy advisor with our UK troops that actually had to do their jobs in line with UK policies, and on the ground in Central Helmand, where they found problems, where they felt inhibited by policy, and they felt they wanted to do things differently, but they felt that they couldn't. I was then seeking to understand what exactly that meant, and then I was able to work back with the Permanent Joint Headquarters and suggest alterations to policy that were passed around. You know how to staff this work. They were passed around senior officials, and you could quite quickly change policy so that it was applicable for use in Central Helmand, where perhaps when at its inception it was never planned to be used in Central Helmand. Now that I'm back in the UK, I'm quite happy to say that when I think about policy, I'm always thinking about its implementation, how it can be implemented by people, quite young, servicemen, 19 years old, in very difficult environments, in the heat, carrying a lot of equipment, and I'm quite particularly focused as well in what that means in terms of resource management. So I feel I've benefited a lot from that experience as well.
All I would do is really just re-echo those 2 points if I was to say too much more, so I won't do that, but I think we'll move on to another question. Is that in terms of what, military or civilians, or?
In terms of your own job, in terms of how you're carrying out policy, in terms of how you're influencing the job that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, Lindy can speak for her time in Helmand, but of course she was there for a year. I was in Baghdad for about 7 months, and personally I think that was an area which was a bit of a weakness, to say that if we've got people continually going through, you don't get the same level of continuity in the system. One of the things which we have done on the military side is we have said specifically that whilst if you're on the front line as a soldier, going into combat every day, then actually 6 months you don't really want to be doing much longer than that. But people who are in key positions in terms of influencing, dealing with local governments, dealing in governance roles, need to be there for longer. And we've extended the period of time, in some cases to 9 months, in some cases to a year, deliberately to cover that point which you've just made. And we're doing the same in terms of certain civilian posts as well. So in Lindy's case, again, that particular job is advertised as a year-long post.
I think if I can add that there's a couple of there's personal and there's collective responsibility. There are basically 2 models for this. Either you have a group that goes out as a group, as a formed unit, which is the way, for example, brigade headquarters goes out. And in that instance, basically, they spend most of probably 18 months preparing to be ready to be fully operational on day 1 when they get out there, basically. The other model, which is the one we use in the PRT, is that you basically have a rolling headquarters. So you're feeding people in all the time. They're doing tours of a minimum length, but they can do longer if they want. And so consequently, you do slightly less group training, but you have a huge personal responsibility to do a lot of personal preparation beforehand, such that you're immediately useful, and also to do personal debriefing afterwards to make sure that you've handed on the lessons of what you've done. I think there's also a lot of responsibility to make sure that you don't unnecessarily change things. So frankly, the short tours or high turnover can be managed if people recognise that's the environment they're in and actually take responsibility for continuing to implement the policies their predecessors put in place, rather than deciding they need to start afresh every time. So, I think you have to be quite careful not to unnecessarily change things just because it's your preference, but actually really only to change things where you think you need to do something in a different way.
The other thing I would probably just add to that is that we deliberately have longer term campaign plans. And so certainly where I'm at the moment in the Permanent Joint Headquarters, then there is an overarching framework within which people will work. So it's not that just because you're in theatre you have a complete carte blanche to do what you want to do. You have to do it within the overarching policy framework and the overarching sort of campaign plan.
command, the Helmand, the Germans may be doing something different in Kunduz, or the Italians up in their area, all within a multinational headquarters, HQ ISAF.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Essentially, ISAF has traditionally taken quite a federal approach to the way it's worked in Afghanistan. So in a sense, nations have taken responsibility for certain areas and have had quite a lot of autonomy to decide how they delivered, either on the military front or on the civilian front in those areas. On the military side, I think that was gripped pretty firmly, particularly under Generals McChrystal and Rodriguez, where they established a 3-star operational headquarters precisely to try and give more command direction to the 2-star regional headquarters and indeed the individual nations, and also where actually they can allocate and move resources around more easily. On the civilian side, it is still, in a sense, quite different between provinces. What we tried very hard to do from a Helmand perspective was to do quite a lot of lesson learning and feedback. So we put effort into making sure we worked closely with the national line ministries, using our embassies in Kabul, to make sure we were feeding best practice back such that they could then push it out in different areas. And certainly, I think Mark and I saw quite a lot of lesson learning going on from what happened in Helmand, transmitted across to what was planned then in Kandahar. But it's not perfect, and it could get better. I think one of the challenges of working in this kind of environment is, and certainly my military colleagues always get very challenged by this is not a hierarchical relationship between a bunch of different organisations. Many of these organisations are voluntarily working together in a loose coalition rather than in a command structure. If you're working with a bunch of different national embassies, for example, although they're all part of NATO, they will also have individual political considerations. So sometimes you have to do this by consensus rather than by direction.
Yeah, I think I'd add as well that within the NATO construct, whilst I was a UK policy advisor within the NATO headquarters, it became clear to me that I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I wasn't sharing information up and down the NATO chain of command with the civilian actors in the NATO chains of command. And so I spent a lot of work with the equivalent POLADs from different nations in my headquarters, in the International Joint Command at the 3-star level, as well as headquarters ISAF up in Kabul. And it paid benefits so that we were all on the same page, and we were able to share our experiences and successes in Central Helmand for the benefit elsewhere. And equally, we would learn from those people that were working in more benign areas of Afghanistan, who were perhaps a few months ahead of us in terms of being able to deliver governance and stabilisation activities, and what we might do when our security situation was better.
I mean, I think it is a well-recognised point, and I had the same experiences in Baghdad. Again, I spent a lot of time working with the American embassy there, and also working with our own embassy and trying to make sure that the American military, the British military, the American State Department representatives in the embassy there, and our British embassy were all broadly thinking along the same sort of lines.
I was wondering what kind of lessons you'd learned from how the military and how you guys worked in those kind of environments in terms of decision making and just general ways of working, I suppose, that you think would be useful for civil servants working at home, and the way we tend to operate in our more kind of comfortable environments over here. If there's anything you think that we could shake up based on your experiences.
I mean, one of the things which I tend to think is that if you look at it from a cross-Whitehall point of view, then actually departments work more collaboratively in theatres than they do back in the UK. I think there's probably at least twofold reasons for that. One of which is because when you're out there, you need to do something quickly, otherwise something could go horribly wrong. And you sort of force the pace on it, and you force a pragmatic, practical solution. Whereas when you're at the other end of a telescope, sat in Whitehall in a nice, comfortable office, then the issues don't necessarily have that same kind of urgency. The other thing I think you get into is a bit more piped look at things from the departments who have got different vested interests in a Whitehall sense. And so they may be wanting to compete, and there are other sort of factors which are dominating that discussion rather than sorting out the problem which is in theatre. And so I think there is a piece which has said to me, sort of bringing on what Lindy said earlier, about understanding the effect of policies on people on the ground, as it were, and trying to translate that as the more dominant issue coming back. And it was interesting, I think, that certainly when I was in the Cabinet Office, as was Lindy, the 3 permanent secretaries of MOD, FCO and DFID made it their sort of business to go, when they went to theatre, to go together, so that they actually got a joint perspective of what was happening, rather than having different people telling them different things because it suited their own particular pet needs. So I think that was actually, if nothing else, iconically a step forward in trying to deliver some of those things.
I learned a couple of things in particular. One was about leadership. I think that the military spend a lot of time thinking about what good leadership looks like, largely because they actually run, in a sense, very large teams of people. And so it certainly helped me, as I've got more senior, to think about how I express what I want the team to do, and actually take a sort of slightly more assertive style of leadership than I would have done otherwise, I think, in a smaller team. I think I also learned a lot about planning and sort of strategizing. Partly, I did the Higher Command and Staff course, which is the military senior staff course, before I went out to Afghanistan for the second time. Partly on that, partly in theatre. I think that they are quite good at thinking through what the end state they want to achieve is and how they're going to do it with a quite complex set of resources, some of which can be flexed quickly, some of which take months to get in place. And if you want to get lots of, heavy equipment out to Afghanistan, it's sort of, it's a months and years long effort, not a short-term thing. And I think that thinking about that, and particularly thinking about risks in that context, I think something I really find helpful. I find the Chief of Staff concept quite useful. So the idea of having a sort of a commander and a Chief of Staff, somebody who's responsible for making the organisation work, so getting sort of the glue to work and getting the staff processes to work. And actually the other thing is, you're working with a bunch of passionately committed public servants who are literally putting their lives on the line for this job, which is very inspiring. And I think, for all the civilians who work in that environment, actually it gives you a real sense of purpose and a real sense of being part of something much bigger. And I think that's certainly something that I've brought back with me.
I think it's quite interesting that one of the things that you couldn't escape to notice within a large headquarters is how they manage large amounts of information to aid the decision making that occurs. Lindy joked about the 5 different IT systems and the 4 different phones, but I had better conferencing, sort of video conferencing facilities in Afghanistan than I do in my day job back in the UK. And so it was very good to see how the military uses new technology to enable them to make these, distill complicated problems so that they can make decisions quickly to have quite an immediate effect. And that's hopefully something we can learn from.
Hi, you mentioned resilience. I wonder if you can give me a sense of the day-to-day frustrations about living in Afghanistan and how much mental strength that you need to develop to cope with it.
I think it's a lot. I mean, is the basic answer, but you can help develop it as a team as well, I think. Fundamentally, the job I was doing, I was working very long hours. In the summer in Afghanistan, in Lashkar-Gah, it gets very, very hot indeed. You get dusted in pretty much every orifice you have when you fly around in a helicopter. It's pretty nasty. It's the only country in the world you can breathe in E. coli as well. It's quite impressive. Don't think about that one too hard because it's a pretty nasty thought. And actually, you are dealing with situations where people are literally walking out the door and not coming back. So I had staff working in places like Sangin who would be working with people who would get blown up and killed or have life-changing injuries. And it does take a lot of resilience. I think you can prepare for it. So before, when I was working in Iraq back in 2004, a really tough time for civil servants working out there, actually, and a really tough time because I think public opinion meant that actually going to Iraq wasn't very popular with friends and family for lots of reasons. Actually, I used to say to people, right, I want you to think before you come back, before you decide to do this job. First of all, what you would do if something happened to you. Secondly, how your family would cope. And thirdly, actually, how you will cope with explaining what you're doing to people when you're out there. So there are lots of sort of things that actually you don't necessarily think about that can be stressful, not just when you're out there. And in a funny way, when you're out there, actually, you have the team that are there with you. You have a sense of adrenaline coursing through your veins. In many ways, actually, you find the resources. I mean, I've seen people from totally different backgrounds all step up and do it. I've very rarely seen people who couldn't cope with that pressure. And actually, the team generally rallied around to make sure they could. Actually, in some ways, the more challenging bit is when you come back home. Because you come back, you don't have that team around you anymore. And actually, you're faced with an environment where people don't always understand what you've done or why you've done it. And they don't understand the triggers. 2 days after I came back from Helmand, I decided in a fit of wanting to kind of, get back into life in London that I would go to a friend's book group. So I found myself sitting in a book group in Kensington reading some novel about life that definitely wasn't Afghanistan, and I've never felt more out of place in my life, to be honest. I felt very dislocated, very frazzled, and as if nobody would ever really understand what I'd been through. And so I think a lot of the challenge is actually dealing with how you come back from these environments as well as how you cope with the pressure when you're out there. And I think, as Mark suggested, we've got a lot better at doing that for people as well, both in the stabilisation unit and in the MOD.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, on that, some of it's always going to be personal to the individual on how they're going to cope with this stuff. There are things which we can do. We have, certainly within the MOD, we've now put in place certain bits of training courses for people going before they go. We also, there's access to occupational welfare, not wealth, services. And we also have sort of counselling sessions and the rest of it to say exactly the sort of points which Lindy said about coming back, and we provide information to the families of people who are going overseas. I think the difference potentially here on the civilian side is that naturally you don't have the same support network as you might do if you're in the military. If you're in the army in particular and you're in a regimental system and everyone goes away together and they come back together and they've had the same experiences, you don't necessarily have that on the civilian side, and you don't have that even in the same way in the Ministry of Defence, which you might thought would be somewhere where people would understand more than other departments. If you've been working, I don't know, in Bristol on acquisition of a particular equipment project, and then you go away for 6, 7, 8, 9 months to Afghanistan, and then you come back to the day job there where people haven't understood, and it's not the sort of military headquarters part of the organisation, then you're going to have a different set of experiences to that if you've been going out as a sort of formed unit with the rest of sort of military colleagues. So I think there are things like that which there are expressed differences in the way in which some of these things are, but we're trying to do our best to make sure that we try and look after every single person, both before in terms of preparation, the families whilst they're away, and then also when people come back.
What I found very useful as well is I spoke about how you had to ruthlessly sort of prioritise your time and your tasks, and in fact you need to prioritise yourself as well and ensure that you are, when immediately you do start feeling tired or you start slipping, you start maybe mishandling information, whatever the little cue is that you're not doing so well, that's your cue to maybe take a morning off, or plan in some time where you can go to the gym or go for a run, do something different. And so, watch a DVD for half an hour before you go to sleep of an evening, something for yourself to rest yourself from the environment you're in. And when people understand that they're not skiving off work, that they're actually helping to sustain their application at work, that's really very useful for them.
The political support either for or sometimes against the particular places that you end up.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's two ways it affects you. One is that personally it can be quite tough for individuals who are out there. So if you feel as if you're working on something that people don't understand or value, that can make the job more challenging. And I think that's where the sort of team resilience comes in. I think from a policy perspective, obviously has a really significant impact, because clearly ministers and politicians have to take into consideration, bluntly, whether they are engaged in something that the public consent to and support, because we live in a democracy. And I think that somebody asked earlier about sort of the understanding you get of the policy-making process from being out, and I think part of what you see very clearly is the link between things that happen, but also the way they're then presented. And certainly in terms of getting better at media skills, it helped me hugely in terms of trying to understand how to communicate what I was doing. I had to do Sky News at lunchtime after Operation Mustra. I had to do CNN morning breakfast. I have to say, personally, I hate doing media stuff, but it wasn't optional. It's part of the job, and part of your job is to explain what your team are doing and why they're doing it, because otherwise you do lose that consent. So I think it teaches you a lot of skills as well, but it does give you a very good insight into what matters. Panchai Palang is a really good example, Operation 2009, because actually people focused a lot on that operation because it was, in a sense, the sort of proactive media feed. But actually many of the casualties were happening in Sangin, which is a slightly different part of Helmand. So sometimes the media picture can slightly misrepresent what's actually going on, and part of our job is to make sure that we try and help people understand what's really happening.
But I think to sort of pick up the point, I think it's more difficult when people are in operational theatres and you see bad news in the press here, which of course gets out there. People get newspapers, people use the internet, people see things on TV. And it's not great for people's morale when they see back here people saying, well, why is it that you should be there? And you get into, I think as Lindy said, it can be quite a difficult leadership issue to be explaining to your own people that notwithstanding the sort of popular press back at home, that this is an important thing which people should be doing.
Hi. Working with local government in this country, you often get the sense that if you were going to build the system again from scratch, you probably wouldn't build something that looked like what we've currently got. So I wondered if you had any examples of kind of international good practice examples you'd drawn on for how you kind of do that reconstruction. Also, you've talked a lot about working across a kind of multinational, multi-agency environment, but I also wondered how you engaged local people, local communities in some of that decision making.
In terms of best practice, I mean, yes, there's lots, and I think that we're really lucky because actually I think that the way that we operate in provincial reconstruction teams is in a sense to draw in a lot of the experience DFID has from working in other developing countries into a sort of slightly more intense stabilisation experience. I think that we did two things in Helmand that I think were really good practice and drew on sort of best practice elsewhere. One was helping to create local district councils. So the law in Afghanistan says that there should be district councils, but there's a real challenge of trying to map the borders of those districts and actually then work out how to run those. It's quite a complicated exercise. We decided that it was such an important issue, so important to give people a voice in their own local government, that actually what we would do, working with the Ministry of Local Government in Kabul, was to pilot a project for how you might try and do this by building on the best of the ways that Afghans had always chosen their local leaders, and actually a couple of new models that gave them then a chance to for actually more genuine democracy. So what we did was put together a system which basically built on what they call the traditional Shura process of basically people meeting together and arguing out both what they thought their local community was geographically, but also who they thought should represent it. And then a final big meeting where actually there was a secret ballot, which meant that if there was a local warlord or a local politician who was strong-arming people into voting for them, there was still a mechanism by which you could frankly say, sure, of course I'll vote for you, and actually, in fact, then do what you wanted at the final count. The second, I think, best practice sort of example is a program called the District Delivery Program, where basically we helped to try and get government services sort of brought down. Government in Afghanistan is quite heavily centralised, partly because it's a very fragile system and a lot very badly broken during the civil war and the Taliban period. We built a system to try and get money to come down from the national ministries to the local government for them to be able to plan how they were going to deliver and basically understand literally what the needs were of their local community and then begin to do it. But also where you could try and get civil servants out to areas that were very unpopular, and you'll understand this working in local government. Nobody wants to go to the difficult, dangerous, boring, rural, nasty place. You have to, and bluntly, you end up having to find incentives, either by paying them better or actually ways that you say, sorry, this is part of the career. And we managed to get far better staffing in some of these remote rural districts in Helmand than we'd had before. And actually, we thought we were doing an okay job. I kept getting told, but it's not 100%, like it's saying, it's not 100% anywhere I've ever seen in the developing world. And I've worked in northern Nigeria, northern Vietnam, lots of challenging places. But actually, when somebody came from Kabul to look at this, they said, wow, this is actually, this is pretty much the best we've seen in Afghanistan. And we realized actually the threshold we were comparing ourselves to was actually, should be the Afghan threshold rather than a sort of a standard. One of the big challenges of working in this kind of environment is everybody comes with a frame of reference based on their own experience, and it's actually getting enough people who've got the right frame of reference, which for Afghanistan is more like Bangladesh or Pakistan or bits of northern Nigeria. It's not Western Europe or America, and actually helping them to understand what good enough looks like in that context. But yeah, we did a lot of it. We're now much better as well, I think, at also lesson learning from this kind of experience, capturing that and passing on, which is another thing actually the military are really good at.
I think certainly one of the things which we did in terms of trying to share best practice in Iraq, up in Baghdad, I mean, obviously it was always going to need to be a political process which was going to eventually be what ends up being successful. But we also needed to do work on reconciliation and reintegration of different insurgencies back into that political system. One of the things which we certainly did was we built on sort of Northern Ireland experience, and we actually brought out Ronnie Flanagan to speak to the various different actors out there as somebody who had actually got practical experience of doing some of this work. And I think it took a while for our sort of Iraqi counterparts to sort of grasp some of that, but looking back on it, I think it was actually a very valuable thing to have done. And it held a much better sway than someone like me trying to speak to the Iraqi Prime Minister's office, which I did, to try and say this is why you should do this and this is why some of these sort of techniques might work. So that sort of thing I think as well people can learn from. I'm happy to answer more questions. The question is, are we going to get kicked out? Maybe one final one? I've had some previous military experience insofar as I've been in the Territorial Army, so I have had some.
I have too.
I haven't. I did Operation Executive Stretch, which I was sold to me by DFID as a management training course, and turned out to be a TA weekend by accident in about 2001, and thought about joining the TA, but in fact they turned me down for what later became what was then the CIMIC group, and then became the Military Support Stabilisation Group, which I've always regarded as slightly ironic because I've ended up working very closely with them ever since. So no, but I've spent an awful lot of time working with them by now. So.
Okay, I think thank you very much for your time and patience, and for bearing with us as we've just slightly overrun. The final task I've got, which is at Gus O'Donnell's personal behest, is to say, please make his session at 4:30.